It's great. This is actually, I have to say that this program is near and dear to my heart. I'd like to thank my team, especially Melissa, for putting it together. And we had a pre-call last week, and one of the interesting things about this is going to be the closest thing to a moderated discussion I've ever, I think, been a part of, because I could have actually stayed on the phone for like 2 hours with all of them. But the way I think we'll do it tonight is we're not going to have prepared statements. We're going to go straight into a conversation. And I'm going to ask Paul to lead off because he's an expert on the nuclear program in North Korea, and then ask Kathleen to give a bit of a political overview, and then finally Admiral Thomas to talk about kind of the geostrategic implications of this, and then the discussion will flow from that. We'll have an opportunity for questions around 7 o'clock or so. So if you have any, just let me know, and we'll work it in. So let's just start with the basic question: where are we with the North Koreans? What's their capability? And maybe a little bit about the leadership as well.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Asia Society of Northern California. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to try not to be Dr. Doom, but I want to do a couple of things, say a couple of things for some takeaways. I don't know how many of you may be Monty Python fans out there, but there's a scene in The Holy Grail where the guards are at the castle and they hear something in the tree line. There's this rumbling, and they look, they don't really see anything, and then suddenly they see someone charging the castle. But then they vanish, and they ignore it. They ignore it again and again, like 3 or 4 times. Someone's charging the castle, and they dismiss it and wave it off, and all of a sudden, their throats are slit right at the door. And I feel that's the way we've been treating North Korea in being too dismissive of their sophistication and their talents when it comes to their nuclear and missile program. I don't want to overstate this, but when they first tested in 2006, it was a fizzle. It was kind of, they don't know what they're doing. And then they launch rockets and missiles and they fail. Well, you learn from failing, right? No one gets it perfect the first, second, sometimes third, fourth, fifth time. And I think it's been partly a fault maybe of just the American pride of our own technological sophistication, the media talking about North Korea being backward in a hermit kingdom and blah, blah, blah. And here we are today with a North Korean nation that has demonstrated 6 times its ability to detonate a nuclear weapon, and this last time, it was a doozy. And the estimates range, but they range with a low end of about 140 kilotons. What that means is 140,000 tons of TNT. Well, I don't know what a ton of TNT looks like, but I know what pictures from Hiroshima look like, and this is 10 times as powerful as that. So they're in the club when it comes to the bombs. Well, what about the missiles? Again, they launched a couple of satellites several years ago. Did they orbit, and did they stay in orbit? No, they didn't. And that's what we seem to focus on. We seem to focus on, they didn't stay in orbit 10 times. They don't know what they're doing. Well, lo and behold, we've seen 2 long-range missile launches over Japan just in the past several months. So I'm not here to tell you precisely what North Korea can do. I don't know if they can launch and hit Fairbanks or hit Guam with much accuracy. But what I will tell you is they don't need to. We need to have enough, I think, respect for the fact that they have been moving from what used to be build a missile and test it and then go back to the drawing board, this sort of one-off type of thing, to a complex of rocket engines, both liquid and solid fueled, different range missiles that they test frequently and with incredible frequency over this last year, and a demonstrated capability to assemble and detonate nuclear warheads. And by the 6th test, I think most experts would say, yeah, they can miniaturize, I think is the wrong word. They can reduce the weight and size to an extent where they can put it on a missile. If we wait for the time when they demonstrate they can hit 10 out of 10 within a mile, we're focusing on the wrong question. What we need to be talking about is they've proceeded enough. They continue to work on their missiles, rockets, and bombs, and we need to manage that. We need to figure out how we live with a North Korea that has nuclear capability. I'd be happy to talk more about, well, what do you mean, Paul? Is it plutonium and uranium or but I really want to make a pitch for we should move beyond hoping or wishing that they won't get there. And as our own current current and past intelligence chiefs have said, we have to assume they are.
So, Ambassador Stephens, as somebody who has spent a good part of her life representing the United States in Korea, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of the geopolitical implications of the nuclear weapons program in North Korea, what it means for the United States, but also for South Korea and Japan and China.
Well,
that's easy, right?
Yeah, Bruce, thank you very much, and I won't try to do that. Since you said don't give a speech, I won't try to do that all at once. But if I may say, just as a way of opening, thank you very much to the Asian Society for all you do. Hit the bottom buttons. Slide it up until it says red. Thank you very much. I also want to say, just as a way of opening, because we're going to talk a lot about, I mean, the title that brought you here is what, Korea on the brink, or crisis in the offing, and so on and so forth. Let's not forget, just begin, that this is also about people on the Korean Peninsula. 25 million people in North Korea, 50-plus million people in South Korea. I think it's about the same as we have here in California. And this has been a shadow that they've been living with for some time, not only the nuclear threat, but the threat of instability and miscalculation and indeed war on the Korean Peninsula, which has indeed been living, and in South Korea's case prospering under not a peace treaty but an armistice since 1953. This is also my way of saying we actually, and I hope I won't embarrass him, we have a North Korean here who's visiting the United States for the first time, who came to South Korea in 2011, Mr. Kim Hak-min, who's in the back, and is studying for his electrical engineering degree at Sogang University. So let's not forget all that talent in North Korea as well as South Korea, all that human potential, which is also suffering from the fact that we have, not only because of the nuclear program, but I think because with the end of the Korean War, we have unfinished business on the Korean Peninsula, and I think we'll need to get to that tonight as well. I won't get to it right now. But why is this so much in the news right now? Why are we suddenly, I have to say, I first went to Korea in 1975. It's more than 40 years ago. I can tell lots and lots of stories about back and forth then. I know you have many too. But I can't think of a time when there's been so much attention in the United States to what's going on in Korea. Maybe that's not all a bad thing. It's also, I guess, kind of a learnable or teachable moment for all of us. But why such a crisis? Well, I mean, obviously, Paul has said the right thing. North Korea has pushed forward with a nuclear program, which has resulted, even now by the most conservative estimates, in a nuclear weapon capacity of some import and an ever-increasing missile delivery ability. I guess I would sort of maybe just not exactly disagree with you, but emphasize something else, and that is, I do think, looking at it, that when Kim Jong Un came to power in 2012, upon the death of his father, but his father had been ill for a few years before that, it seems to me that he really doubled down on this program. And that there has been, shall we say, a clarity from him over the last 5 years that he is absolutely determined that it is the highest priority to achieve nuclear state status. Now, I think there's a debate to be had about what Kim Il-sung might have done had he lived longer, what Kim Jong-il had done. But the fact is, we had agreements with the North Koreans before, which they didn't live up to. They'd say we didn't live up to them in some ways either. But we had agreements that had as their ultimate goal the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So I think one big question, which I would put out there in the political way, and you've alluded to it, is that no longer salient? Do we give up on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? And what are the implications of that, not only for the region, or for the security of the United States, but for our non-proliferation regime, for what we say about nuclear weapons. And I think that's part of the discussion that we might have. But that's one big reason. North Korea's, Kim Jong-un's acceleration, doubling down on the nuclear program, and his success in moving forward very quickly in ever greater capabilities. But there's a second reason, and it's hard for me. I worked for the government for a long time to talk about our own politics. We were always kind of trained, you probably were too. Don't talk about your own politics. But we have a different administration in Washington. we have a president who has a very different style. And I don't think it's just style, but while we have a new administration in Washington that in some ways has pursued elements of the same policy that's been pursued by past administrations, both Democratic and Republican, of pressure and incentives, carrots and sticks. Or as the Trump administration has put it, not Mr. President Trump himself, I'm not sure he's used those words, but his cabinet has, maximum pressure, maximum engagement. And in fact, the Trump administration has been quite successful in marshaling international pressure, including from the Chinese, for greater sanctions, greater pressure on North Korea. What we haven't seen is yet a pivot towards engagement or a sense of what that engagement is. And there's been a sense that the engagement has been undercut by the pattern of tweets, and not only tweets from the president, but also the speech at the UN, which really grabbed the attention of the leadership in Pyongyang, where the president at the UN General Assembly threatened the destruction, the totally destroying of North Korea itself. Words actually matter a lot in Asia. I think we all know that. I mean, they kind of matter here, but one thing I take from my diplomatic experience in Asia is, boy, there are these bright young diplomats, and they're in Seoul, they're in Tokyo, they're in Beijing, and they're in Pyongyang too. I actually met someone who met a young North Korean diplomat recently, said he spoke perfect English, he had kind of a Kim Jong Un haircut, but perfect English, and he had memorized everything that President Trump has said about North Korea in English. He just knew it. These words matter. And because this is such an unconventional approach that our administration is taking, I think that the risk of, at the very least, miscalculation, misunderstanding, escalation is higher than it's ever been. And it's more dangerous than it's ever been because, again, in North Korea, they have developed these capabilities and clearly stated they are going to continue. Now, are they, and this is, again, part of a discussion I hope we'll have later, when will Kim Jong Un feel he has enough? And at that point, will he come to the table? What will engagement look like? I do hope and believe that at some point, the Trump administration is ready to go for maximum engagement. We haven't seen it yet. Other elements there, obviously, we've got, and I'll just kind of list them here as things we might want to talk about. The electoral success of Prime Minister Abe on Sunday, who called essentially a snap election, largely because he assessed, according to all reports, that the threatening behavior of North Korea made it an opportune time for him to gain a new mandate from the Japanese people, and indeed he did, although polling in Japan shows, while anxiety about the North Korean threat, ambivalence about other parts of his program, particularly on the side of security and military reform and so-called normalization. South Korea has a new president who enjoys still large and wide public support after an extraordinary political year in South Korea, but I think looks with some anxiety at the relationship with the United States. He has not been able to establish the kind of relationship with President Trump that Mr. Abe has. And, of course, there's President Trump now going to Asia starting next week, starting with a trip that will go to Japan. It's a long trip, makes you tired just thinking about it. Japan, Korea, China, where, of course, there's just been the Party Congress. Xi Jinping gives a 3.5-hour speech and doesn't actually mention Korea. And then President Trump will go on to Southeast Asia. So I think this is a very timely discussion that we're going to have tonight. There's a lot in play in terms of, again, the U.S. posture. I guess I'm always more comfortable, even though I'm not in this administration, trying to look at it from how do we see it. On the one hand, as I said, I think that the Trump administration has had some success in strengthening our defenses, and strengthening cooperation with our allies to contain and deter, in outlining a policy of growing pressure on North Korea and in gaining important support from the Chinese and others in the Security Council and elsewhere. But that has been and continues to be undercut by this, to say it as mildly as I can, this very confusing and indeed, I would think potentially dangerous mixed signals coming in terms of the rhetorical statements.
So I'm kind of curious now that we set the stage a little bit with where the North Korean program is, and sort of the politics of South Korea and the United States. But what's the military dimension? I think what makes this so three-dimensional is the fact that it's not simply a case of diplomacy or economic relations. There's a serious military dimension and not just a conventional one. So, Admiral Thomas, I'm very interested actually in what your views are on this. The United States has had a long-standing presence in South Korea, largely because of the North and the legacy of the Korean War. So if you're an admiral looking at this both as a military man, but also as somebody who now has been able to step back a bit and look at it, the broader picture, what do you see?
Bruce, I think that, the military aspects of this, and what I'll do up front, because Paul and the ambassador have really kind of set the scene for you perfectly, is just give you a practitioner's perspective. And remember, for most of the U.S. military leadership in Asia, they really kind of look through a five-sided lens, and that's the five-side, treaty allies, really. Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand. And those military-to-military relationships are long-standing. So when I look into the Korean Peninsula and the issues associated with it, I really look through that military-to-military piece of the Republic of Korea, the ROK-U.S. alliance. Something that Kathleen pointed out that has really changed over the last 5 years. When she was the ambassador, you saw this start to percolate a little bit with, the nuclear tests are more robust, the ballistic missile testing is more successful. But for the most part, the military provocations were local. What's so different now, and I think why the reason we are actually sitting here, is because the strategic reach of KJU, of Kim Jong Un, has changed that calculus. He doesn't need to spend any time on local provocations anymore. He can actually bypass the peninsula and now provoke Japan, the U.S. directly. And that adds this dimension that is going to put huge stress on the military-to-military alliances in Asia. And President Moon, I think, has brought that up. There shall be no conflict on the Korean Peninsula, basically without my permission. Well, guess what, Mr. President? North Korea now has a huge vote that has got a strategic reach that can bypass you. From a military perspective, I think Secretary Mattis said it best. Any military conflict on the peninsula the words look like catastrophic, horrific. If you've ever spent any time on the peninsula, I mean, the ambassador will tell you, you sit there in Seoul knowing that you are underneath the umbrella of North Korean long-range artillery from the Kaesong Heights. And that is, instantaneous if they decide it to be. And the casualties in the greater Seoul metropolitan area would be massive before you could neutralize that long-range artillery. And that's conventional. Now you add these other dimensions. There's just no way to get around a military-to-military kinetic fight on the peninsula. Is going to be just a huge number of casualties. The South Korean economy will be significantly affected. Let me just give you one simple example. If you just decided to mine the waters off of Busan, that maritime corridor, about 60 miles from Busan to maybe Gwangyong, that's 70% of everything that goes in and out of Korea. And you can shut that off, and you don't have to shut it off for very long before the economy, the citizenry really start to hurt. non-combatant evacuation operations. The ambassadors had to deal with this chapter and verse, okay? How do you move all the Americans out? How do you move all of the other foreign nationals out of the peninsula while this conflict would be going on? It's just the humanitarian aspects of this are horrendous. What I've thought about since leaving the military in January after 38 years and spending a lot of it on the Korean Peninsula is, there's really kind of three scenarios we might want to talk about. One of them the ambassador's already teed up, and so has Paul, and that is, all right, it's kind of the status quo. KJU keeps testing. They continue to weaponize their nuclear capability, and we have to live with a nuclear-capable North Korea that has global reach. Another scenario might be a provocation cycle, a typical provocation cycle, but now it's got a little more reach to it. Unlike the Chonan sinking or shelling of one of the Northwest Islands, where it's 40 or 50 South Koreans killed. Now it's a ballistic missile test that goes wrong over Japan. That starts to look fundamentally different as a provocation than something that you would consider local. And then there's the third option, and Kathleen mentioned this because the president's rhetoric is absolutely unhelpful. From a military to military perspective, our allies are looking for consistent, biased toward calm, planning, and conversation. The tweet program is absolutely antithetical to that. There's not a day that I don't, wake up and thank, the fact that Jim Mattis and John Kelly and H.R. McMaster are riding herd on what appears to be kind of a Twitter account gone absolutely wrong. So with that in mind, this third option is this preemption. And that scares all of us. Trust me, the military planners, it scares us more than anybody. I would say just from based on Paul's comments, we should all probably use about an 18-month planning assumption. That in 18 months, unless something radically changes, North Korea will have an intercontinental ballistic missile with a viable re-entry vehicle that is a nuclear warhead. And that means that, the west coast of the United States might be an option. Now, if you're the executive assistant for Kim Jong Un, you ought to be walking into his office every day and say, boss, absolutely do not give up your nuclear weapons or your ballistic missile program. You have built a deterrent that has brought other countries now to the point where they have to deal with you. It's not just local provocation cycles where they can kind of disregard you and, send more grain and call it a day. Okay? The other thing I'd probably do is put a portrait of Muammar Gaddafi in his office and say, warning, you give all this up, bad things will happen to you, boss. Well, that's kind of the scenario that we're trying to counter, right? How do you work around that one? And so I think the discussion tonight, it'll be interesting to tease those out. Thanks.
Okay, so the one major issue that I don't think we've yet addressed is maybe the biggest is what about China? And on the one hand, I think the Chinese have actually, if not facilitated, they've certainly allowed the North Korean program to move ahead. So in some ways they own this, although I'm not sure exactly that's how they would see it. But the question is, what kind of options do the Chinese have now, given that the North has this viable nuclear weapons program? Because in some points, there's an issue here, I think, of this is a bit of a monster for them. I mean, if Abe is able to change the Constitution, the Japanese get more assertive, if the South gets more assertive, this doesn't really benefit China. So maybe I'd be curious in every one of your views. So maybe, Paul, if you could start, and then Kathleen.
Sure. Yeah, I may be brief because I may know the least about this, but I guess my take on China is that I think a lot of this is still true, which is for years as I watch people like Kathleen and governmental and non-governmental practitioners engage with North Korea and sort of figure out whether it was the six-party talks, a multilateral sort of process, or even direct sort of U.S.-China talks. The trick is we don't have the fundamental same priority ranking of what constitutes a security threat on the peninsula. We haven't for years. For us, it has been the nuclear program. The nuclear program is all about the nukes, it's about the uranium, about the plutonium. And China, plays the long game. They have a much longer view of history, and for them, they're thinking, yeah, that's troublesome, but it's not a big deal. We like having them there. They separate you from us and the South Koreans from us. So the question over those years was, how ticked off do they have to get to sort of bring somewhat of a hammer down? And the answer, we don't know the answer, but there have been episodic periods when China did sign on to UN Security Council resolutions. China did, in fact, enforce those resolutions to an extent. I think we, the United States, have always had an inflated idea of how much leverage they have. It's not unlimited, it's limited, but it is significant. And then also the willingness of China to use that leverage. So you need to have the leverage and the willingness, and those cases have been few and far between over, say, the last 15 years. Not absent, but few and far between. I think we have the most daylight we've had in a long time between the United States and China right now, despite their signing on to the recent Security Council resolution, although it was watered down. And I think the other aspect is, the statements like as close as lips and teeth and so on. I would never call China an ally of North Korea. I would call them sort of codependent. They each have reasons for keeping the conversation open, but ally, that might have been 60s, 70s, even through the mid 80s. But like with the fall of the Berlin Wall, post Tiananmen and with China becoming much more flexible and open as an economy, I don't see a lot of love there. And so I would say, from a diplomatic point of view, the most important thing to do is have continued, frequent, and substantive conversations with Beijing to say, we're not on the same page, but there's some overlap of those pages. Let's work with that and move forward. Again, what that overlap, what that Venn diagram looks like, I'd like to hear, from Robert and Kathleen, but it's not absent. And then we can begin to have a conversation about what I would like to think Beijing is thinking now, like, oh, geez, they really have moved the needle with their program and with their capabilities. And yes, an implosion or a refugee flow across, into China is probably still their number one priority, but I'd have a hard time believing they're not far more concerned with the nuclear program than they were, say, even 3 years ago.
Would you agree with that, Ambassador Stephens?
I think they're probably, yes, more concerned than 3 years ago, but I'm not sure that their fundamental assessment has changed. The Chinese like to have 3 no's and 4 yeses and so on, and they've had the kind of 3 no's on the Korean Peninsula for quite a while, since this whole nuclear issue became salient. And their kind of order of priority was no war, no instability, no nukes. Well, I think, we agree with that, but I guess the question is, do we still agree with that in that order? And I think actually the Chinese still feel very strongly about that. That no, they don't want nukes on the Korea. They don't want nukes in North Korea. They don't want nukes in South Korea or Japan. But it's lower on the priority list than avoiding war at all, essentially all costs, or instability, including the collapse of the regime. And I think that's what's guided their approach. I think it's notable that Xi Jinping, in his almost 4-hour speech at the Party Congress just concluded, made no mention of Korea. I think it's notable that when a month or so ago, I lose track of time here, but a month or so ago, when there seemed to be this, kind of ratcheting up of tensions that maybe the U.S. was going to try something preemptive, that the Chinese came out with a statement I'm kind of paraphrasing here, and maybe you'll remember more exactly, but it basically it just kind of tried to walk a line and say if the U.S. attacked North Korea, China would defend it, but it also wouldn't support North Korea if it did something aggressive. So, on that level, I would say I think where we might find some common ground with the Chinese is maybe in two dimensions. One is, and I actually think this is in our interest too, and it goes to what you were talking about. You're an expert in this. I mean, the United States, we have a lot of practice in deterrence, right, including extended deterrence. How do you transparently signal that that the use of nuclear weapons, if it's any use, is going to result, and this would certainly be the case of North Korea, with the destruction of North Korea. I don't think our president has had that concept. I don't want to sound condescending about it, explained to him, or that he has internalized that. But I think the language of deterrence and the deep experience that many in and outside our government have in that is salient and would help us to kind of calm the waters, both with North Korea and also with respect to China. That's only the first step. And then the next step does have to be to work on some kind of diplomatic approach. And there, I think the Chinese, the one thing that we were able to do, not successfully, but we were able to do in the six-party talks was to get China to take some agency in this issue. And that we need to, I think, try to do again. Maybe not the six-party talks, but...
Well, I think one interesting issue for me in this is that I spent a long time in Europe as a part of the arms control world, and there were, in dealing with the Soviets/Russians, there were an extensive level of contacts, mutual verification, a lot of meetings between the militaries at senior but also not senior ranks, verification visits, opportunities to exchange views. And so the chance of an accident kind of spiraling out of control, I think, were not that high. We don't have that level of confidence in dealing with certainly not with North Korea at all, but also really with China. So in your response here, I would kind of hope you might weave some of those thoughts in, because you really don't have the mechanism to cope with, I think, many of the things that we take for granted in the arms control arena in Europe.
Yeah, Bruce, I think that you've identified a key avenue that we need to not just explore, but we actually have to, kind of get to the point where we're having strategic arms limitation talks with China in a viable way, because it sets up these communication ligatures that actually bear fruit that is, kind of second and third order effects. It's not just controlling a nuclear stockpile. It's not just, okay, I get to fly over your country and you get to fly over mine and we're going to trade pictures and so on and so on. It sets up, as you pointed out, this dialogue at a lot of different levels in the government. If we were sitting in Beijing, they would also say, and I think this goes to the ambassador's point, they'd love to have that dialogue with North Korea right now, and they don't have it. We give Beijing way too much credit for the leverage they actually have in the North Korean capital right now. Obviously, they've got the huge economic stick. 85% of everything that goes in and out of North Korea has to pass through China in some form at this point. The oil issue is still very, very relevant. Every time I talk to North Korean experts, if you will, guys like Steph Haggard down at UCSD, that oil piece is very, very important in the strategic calculus. But everything that we've seen over the past 5 years is how incredibly resilient the North Korean economy is. I can remember 20 years ago, and Kathleen can too, that's it. Yeah, they'll be starving to death, and then we've got to worry about an implosion, and how do we handle the humanitarian crisis? Well, we've had that wrong. They can suffer through an incredible amount of pain and sustain a very, very robust military-industrial complex. One of the current estimates that I've seen is 60,000 engineers, scientists, mechanics involved in their weapons programs, their high-end weapons programs, including their nuclear capability, their ballistic capability, cyber, is another aspect, that they have global reach. They're incredibly resilient. One of the discussions we had prior to the actually coming out and sitting down with you is, at what point does North Korea look like a liability instead of an asset to China? My estimate right now is that China still sees it, kind of like Paul says, as somewhat of an asset, still a vassal state that's a buffer. And they have along with the Russians, the Chinese have a different strategic urgency than the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the U.S., because those missiles are pointed at those three countries, and right now not at China and Russia. It doesn't mean it can't change in the future. But remember, one of the issues that's playing in the background, if I'm in Beijing, especially as a military planner, I would sure like to weaken the U.S. alliances in Northeast Asia. I've had to put up with the U.S. military basically wandering past my front yard for the last 75 years with impunity. And I want to change that. I want more freedom of movement in Asia. And one of the ways I do it is start to weaken those alliances, especially the military-to-military aspects of it. And North Korea, the nuclear issue, the ballistic missile issue, that is a great wedge to weaken those alliances. So if I'm China, I'm going to participate from an international community perspective, but I'm not going to do it with an urgency as I would see from Japan, U.S., or South Korea.
Can I challenge you a little on that? Because I remember that, as I recall, and my memory may be a bit hazy, but the South Koreans were due to take control of their military in wartime. As I understand it, the Status Forces Agreement, the U.S. is an ally, but during wartime, the U.S. commander-in-chief would be an American. And I recall, I think it happened about the time of the Cheonan incident, that this was up for review, and the South Koreans, who had been earlier prepared to extend that and become kind of masters of their own fate, went back to the United States and said, you know what, you guys, let's just keep things the way they are. So I wonder, in fact, is this really playing into the Chinese, the direction the Chinese want? Because it could, I think, and reinforce the need to keep the Americans around in Japan and South Korea and other places. So I'm wondering if is that entirely true? I mean, it's one way of potentially weakening it, but it also could actually end up strengthening our relationship, at least in the military sphere.
Yeah, Bruce, I think that, that argument is, got a lot of backing. If General Brooks was here, the U.S. Forces Korea commander, he'd probably absolutely agree with you. I think, though, the change in the strategic calculation, this ability for North Korea to bypass South Korea, is adding a dimension. Sandy Winnefeld, when he was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in 2012, made a comment in testimony essentially that, hey, everybody, I'm not sure you're paying attention, but North Korea with nuclear weapons and ballistic missile reach changes our calculation. We've been traveling under this, obligatory calculation, and Kathleen remembers it very, very well. Twice a year, we do a dress rehearsal for war on the peninsula. I mean, it's to the point where I can go to somebody at a train station in Seoul, and they could probably scratch out the war plan on the back of the envelope because it's been done so many times over the last 50 years. I wonder about the relevancy of that once you can bypass South Korea. And my sense, and this, I may have this wrong because it's been a couple of years since I've spent a lot of time on the peninsula, but I think the younger generation in South Korea, very well educated, very tuned to economic ligatures that are being built with countries other than the U.S., are starting to get a little tired of 28,500 U.S. uniforms on the peninsula, which they see perhaps And the THAAD issue kind of brought this to bear as, hey, are the U.S. forces actually starting to look like a liability? Are they a target? Maybe it's time to revisit this.
Can I jump in? I think the other aspect of this I think is important to remember is, you know, you mentioned having a picture of Gaddafi on the wall, and I would add maybe, you know, Saddam as well, and maybe even someone non-nuclear like Ceausescu, right? Like, and let's keep in mind, Kim Jong Un is 33 years old. He's not 70. So some you know, retirement deal, exile, you know, you can't. Yeah, well, he's not 75, 78. So he's probably less interested particularly in a deal from the United States with a leader currently that doesn't seem to respect deals or have much stake in them. So what I was going to say or suggest is that, you know, I think the United States has far more leverage than China. Is it in trade? No. Is it in oil and supplies? No. It's not even in the military might and the presence in the region or the peninsula. It's the fundamental thing that North Korea has said for years and years and years is what they're after, which is an end to the armistice, some type of a peace regime and treaty. And I would say that since the nuclear program, it serves at least two purposes, which is ensuring the survival of the regime, but providing national or stature equity to the U.S. You know, it's not sort of aimed at China saying, hey, we're as big as you. It's aimed at Washington, literally and figuratively, talk to us as equals, respect our status as a nuclear state. And so I think the challenge then for the alliances the U.S. has in the region is how do we diplomatically overshoot, or maybe not overshoot is the right word, if we got to a place where the U.S. was talking to Pyongyang in a constructive way, how do we talk to Seoul and Tokyo about that? And you know, whether they enter into, say, four-party talks, there was a process like that at one point. I think that's what we ought to be doing, or that's what the American leadership needs to think is, oh, they're actually talking to us. They're actually interested in sort of equity and that kind of a dialogue.
Well, I think both of you are getting to what I think is a central point that we're now directly addressing, and that is sort of, you know, what does Kim Jong Un want? You know, why does he have a nuclear program? Why has he pursued this at tremendous cost in every sense of international isolation, of economic sanctions, of condemnation by the world, and so on and so forth? And I think implicit, but I just want to be explicit, I would say I think the first reason is the survival of his regime in a very asymmetrical environment. And yes, over the years, you know, I've seen this, it's a divided peninsula, and there's been a battle for dominance and legitimacy. The South Korea I arrived in the 1970s had only recently surpassed GDP per capita of North Korea. But from there, it just, you know, the lines crossed and went in opposite directions. North Korea cannot compete with South Korea, or never mind the United States, in any kind of traditional military sense. And you all have seen that over years and years. So you find some unconventional ways of doing it. And one is an investment in nuclear weapons, which, by the way, South Korea wanted to do too after after the withdrawal of the U.S. from Vietnam and the Guam Doctrine, and they felt they needed to have some capability of their own. And we told them, sorry for the digression, the United States, one of my predecessors, you can have the alliance or you can have nuclear weapons, but you can't have both. The North Koreans went forward with it, and I think this remains the main reason why Kim Jong-un has made this such a priority. I think it has also become kind of Exhibit A in the battle for legitimacy on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea doesn't match South Korea in any other way, by any other measure, but to its own people. And you see this in the internal, you know, propaganda information machine. We have missiles, we have nuclear weapons. It makes us able to sit at the top table, not only with the United States, with other countries. But then I think there you see an analysis, and there's hints of it here, of, so where does he go from there? So once he has gotten to where he thinks he needs to get, And my own sense is he thinks he's almost there. You know, maybe it's one more test or two more tests or a few more weapons. He's almost there with this capability. I don't think the intent is to, you know, nuke San Francisco. I mean, I think he does understand, even absence the clarity on deterrence I'd like to see, he understands that that's, you know, that's the end of North Korea. I mean, it doesn't matter who's president. It doesn't matter, right? That's not the intent. But is he looking for it to get to the table and to be able to wrest a better deal and survival of his regime? And that's very difficult to do with because we do have elections and presidents change and promises get broken and so on. And there is this line of thought which I don't quite subscribe to. I don't subscribe to, but I think it's worth putting out there. Is this an effort to eventually, and you were kind of alluding to this, to split the alliance? To basically challenge the United States, as actually de Gaulle did after World War II. You know, given a choice, will you trade Seattle for Seoul, right? If there's a threat on the homeland, will that weaken and put a wedge between us and our South Korean, or for that matter, our Japanese allies? And will that then allow Kim Jong-un to move towards the, you know, long-held ambition of dominating the Korean Peninsula and even reunification on his terms? To me, maybe I have a lack of imagination here. I don't think the 50+ million people of South Koreans, I mean, they may, you know, some may or may not want to see American soldiers there, but I don't think they're ready to say they're going to turn their backs on all they've built and say, okay, yeah, I guess Pyongyang's okay. I can't see that happening. But I think we don't know enough about Kim Jong-un's intent. The other point I would make about China is China has done itself no favors. This year was the 25th anniversary. I'm talking about South Korea, well, North Korea too, but you know, South Korea is the largest. Let me put it another way. China imports more from South Korea than any other country. And of course, I mean, China is South Korea's largest trading partner. It's true of so many countries in the world. It's a very big relationship. The South Korean-China relationship is, by all measures, except this kind of rather anachronistic one, if you like, the more important of the Korea relationships that China has. This year is the 25th anniversary of the normalization of relations, which occurred in 1992. They couldn't even agree to have any kind of, you know, party together because the Chinese have imposed such sanctions on South Korea, de facto sanctions, over this issue of the the missile defense, the THAAD program. You know, it's kind of ironic that the one place where economic sanctions from China seem to have a real impact was in South Korea. You know? But it's been a real souring of the relationship. And I don't say that with any glee, but I do think that it's made, and you see this in the public opinion polling, you know, recognition on the part of the South Korean public and its elected leadership across the board that the U.S. South Korea alliance, including the military alliance, remains the foundation for South Korea's security.
One of the interesting insights I just took away from this part of the discussion was it's interesting because for a long time we thought of the North Koreans as the erratic element in these relationships, and of course the United States, as the Admiral mentioned, the United States was consistent. What our allies wanted was consistency with a kind of calmness. Now we're the erratic ones, and I think that's what's really upended the entire international system. And so if I look at this now, I guess the question becomes, if you're South Korea, what do? You've got a bad relationship with China that probably isn't going to get any better in the near term. You've got the Japanese who you really have a lot of histories with that are not positive. So if you're the South Koreans, you know, where do you go? What's your end game in all this?
Bruce, let me just kind of slice off the military aspect of that. The Republic of Korea has a very, very capable military in all respects. Still dominated by the land component, the 1st and 3rd ROK armies. The military, when you move them away from their politicians, perhaps over an adult beverage, they will openly tell you, we understand. In a conflict on the peninsula, we absolutely have to have Japan. We have to have support. A lot of you know this group is very well informed. There are 6 UN bases in Japan and their reason for being is to support UN forces on the peninsula. So as you look at, the trilateral aspects of Northeast Asia with the Republic of Korea, with Japan and the U.S., the military-to-military aspects of that are well exercised. They're not advertised because of the politics in South Korea and the politics in Japan, which my colleagues know very, very well. It's kind of kept on the down low, but that portion of the alliance is long-standing and in very good shape.
Kathleen, Paul, you want to add anything?
Well, in terms of what does South Korea do?
Where do you go?
I think they have to take a little bit of all of the above strategy, but the number one, and I think we'll see this as President Trump goes to the region next week, is try, pull out all the stops to try to manage a relationship with an administration that has been deeply disconcerting to the South Korean body politic. The issue of trade, this is trade with South Korea, right? The threat to withdraw from the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement, something negotiated under the Bush administration, ratified under the Obama administration, seen as a model for the TPP, which of course has also been abandoned. To have that threatened to for the U.S. to withdraw from that the same weekend that North Korea was testing. To have a presidential tweet which used the word appeasement to describe the South Koreans' president's approach to North Korea. It's very challenging for them, but I think that the priority remains to try to have a good visit, to try to have some wins for President Trump in terms of trade, and to build the relationship in the same way that Mr. Abe has been able to build a relationship, because that is the sine qua non of being able to do anything else. Now, it doesn't mean they're working on trying to repair the relationship with China, which has been so badly damaged by the spat over THAAD, and there's work going on that. But they have a real challenge. Maybe I'm just betraying some sympathy to them. They have a big challenge here, and maybe we'll see some hedging. But I think right now they don't see much choice, given the threats from North Korea, but to try to show solidarity, and then when the time is right, to say, yes, part of engagement has to be that inter-Korean dimension, of lowering tensions, of getting something going with North Korea. But Pyongyang, in its always most unhelpful way, has spurned every effort on the part of Seoul to get something going. So I think there's a great deal of frustration and anxiety in Seoul and in the Republic of Korea right now.
So I'm going to open the floor to questions in a sec, but I guess it was the week before last, President Trump decertified the Iran deal, and if you're shifting gears slightly, if you're Kim Jong Un, you call it KGU, is that the term? I had never used that. I hadn't heard that before.
The military acronyms.
So I think maybe Paul, just a quick question for you is, what lessons, if you're KGU, do you take away from that?
To put it simply, that you can't trust this administration further than you can throw them, because that might be one lesson. The other lesson might be, well, he's a man of his word, because he spent a good part of his campaign on foreign policy saying how awful the Iran deal was. But in all seriousness, so one sort of disclaimer, in my former job as a program director at the Plowshares Fund, we were strong supporters of the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We saw it for a variety of reasons as, for all of the things that Iran does that are bad, do you want to add having a nuclear weapon to it? And so we saw this arrangement that was multilateral, European partners, China, Russia, as, a good deal and an effective deal for a decade or so, not forever. And the International Atomic Energy Agency and the intelligence community has basically said, yes, they're abiding by it. So taking politics out of it for a minute, whether you think the deal is a good one or not, the judges that stand in judgment of this say, well, the Iranians are adhering to it. Then you have a president of the United States essentially not killing it outright, but doing something that's within his power to do, basically failing to re-endorse it, thus throwing it to the Congress to take some legislative step to keep the deal going. So not only is Tehran upset because they thought they had a deal, but if you're Kim Jong-un, you look at this and you say, there's one more data point that shows me I can't trust this president of the U.S. And despite what someone like Secretary Rex Tillerson and his team may be telling me or telling my interlocutors in places like Beijing or Singapore, and they're providing some hint at carrots, I don't think they're fully grown yet. Why on earth would I believe that? Pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. He's not showing a particular affection for multilateral agreements. And so, there you go.
Ambassador Stephens or Admiral Thomas, any thoughts you want to add to that?
Well, again, when you look at it from Kim Jong-un's perspective, as Paul mentioned, okay, there's another data point. He's set a course that he's made it very clear. I think if you look at if you just pictured the leaders of the six-party talks, those countries at a card game, Russia kind of is. We haven't talked about Russia in this conversation. We probably should tease that out during the question and answer period. But the one who's playing the hand very, very well right now is the North Korean leader. And said, I'm going to keep building this deterrent, knows full well that from a kinetic perspective, he can never use it. But to the ambassador's point, to Paul's point, brings a level of respect that gets them to the table as the starting point for renegotiation. But to Paul's point, the assumption would be, hey, the U.S. is going to deal in good faith. I'm not sure how that assumption goes right now as you look at the Iran decertification.
Okay, so I'm going to open the floor for questions. I would point out that Kim Jong-un actually does have one real asset or one real point that I think in his favor, which is that he sent millions of Americans scurrying to their thesaurus or their dictionary to figure out what the word dotard meant, which was actually a pretty good word, actually. All right, so I have a mic and I'm not afraid to use it, and so we're going to pass it around. And Laura on my staff is here, so there's a question right here, Laura. Oh, sorry. We have time for a few.
It's a small room. On China, I would propose that China used to have a reason to cooperate with the United States in preventing nuclear proliferation in the area. But now they don't. And the reason they don't is that it's already happened. They wanted to prevent it because it would have resulted, and it will result almost inevitably, in further proliferation and eventually missiles aimed at China. The Chinese do have every reason to not cooperate with the U.S. because as long as this is a problem, it distracts the U.S. from dealing with China. And the geopolitical aspect of having a buffer state over history, under these historical circumstances, with the surrounding powers being all strong, the peninsula has to be divided or else it's an unstable situation. So I think that we're not going to get any cooperation from the Chinese, and we're headed toward nuclear proliferation in the region. I wonder if you'd like to comment.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think, yeah. Well, I really like the first half of what you said. When I say like, I mean it's a very persuasive point that if China was, even sort of half interested in working in the six-party process, maybe better to have a North Korea that's a buffer, that's not nuclear capable to the extent they are today, so we'll play along. I guess it's the proliferation side of the equation, or of what you said, that, well, first of all, concerns me greatly. Secondly, I'd have to think a bit about, would that really happen? I mean, we have seen hawkish elements in Seoul and in Tokyo over the years talk about, it's time for us to get ours. You know, forget the Non-Proliferation Treaty, forget the culture and the norms and the history. We're talking about our national security and sovereignty. Let's do it. It's not a very sophisticated comment I'm about to make, but my sense is that those voices get a little larger, and not just louder, but more numbers in the Diet, in the Blue House, or in the South Korean Parliament of late, and that concerns me. Now, yes, and so I guess the question might go back to what Robert said: is you can have nuclear weapons, you can have an ally, but not both. So playing that scenario out, it would absolutely collapse the non-proliferation regime, which I would say, despite its sort of stasis of late, has been a huge success story in managing and, in fact, greatly limiting the spread of nuclear weapons. When it was conceived of in the late 60s and came into force, the fear was we'd have 30 nuclear states, or 40 in a decade or two. We have 9.
When you love something, you got to learn to let it go.
So I don't have a good answer for saying no, that won't happen, other than I'd like to believe that won't happen. But I think the first part of your thesis is really interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of insight in what you say. I read an op-ed just last week by the Singaporean former foreign secretary. And Singaporeans have really smart diplomats. They have really smart everybody. And actually, but much to my surprise, I mean, he was writing, let's get used to it. Japan and South Korea are going to have nuclear weapons. China's going to live with it. It's not going to upset them. They'll only. I mean, this is one person, but I'm repeating it because I thought it was stimulating and chiming with what you said. But Taiwan would be an issue if Taiwan developed it. But my point is, yeah, this is not played out quite the way that we imagined or thought. You know, it's kind of, I mean, 10 years ago, when I was also working on North Korea, you know, we would say to the Chinese, because we thought it was a great argument, you know, watch out. You know, I mean, South Korea, they can develop nuclear weapons. Japan, you're not going to want that. Well, no, they don't want it. But you know, again, in their list of what they really think they can live with and what they can't live with, it doesn't seem to date to have given them the kind of pause that you think it might. The second thing I'm kind of adding to yours is, I think, I wonder if you're recording this, I think Xi Jinping he's figured out Donald Trump. I think he thinks he's kind of a paper tiger. And so I think that's why you see what is otherwise a kind of inexplicable, like, okay, let's, you know, we've done certain things, and the pressure will continue to build, but let's, you know, just stick with no war, and try to make sure that there's no escalation here. If we can do that, I'll make the next point later. I don't want to give another speech here.
So, Matt, I think your point was on target, but I have more confidence in the extended deterrence than you do. I look at Japan and South Korea, and I saw another article today on, hey, let's bring tactical nukes back to the South Korean, part of the peninsula. I think they left in 1991 or thereabouts, if I remember.
The Korean opposition is in Washington arguing for it right now.
Absolutely, but I just think that the citizenry I've got a lot of confidence in South Korean and Japanese citizens. They're very well read, very well informed, and I think the backlash would be huge. And so maybe I'm using hope as a course of action, but I think the extended deterrence regime has served us very, very well, and I see that going on quite a ways in the future.
If they have confidence in it, if our allies have confidence in it, if they start to think they need a hedge.
Absolutely. But, one of the things that over on the military side, and Kathleen will remember this, yes, we support the Japanese self-defense force and the ROK forces in the case of an armed conflict. But the other thing that our alliances do is they're restraining orders. There are restraining orders from those countries being too proactive in their defense. The rock forces are spring-loaded for every provocation, and what the alliance really does, or has done traditionally, is kept them from, making that ultimate mistake. And I'm convinced that the alliances will weather this current administration's rhetoric, and I'm talking about U.S. rhetoric, and extended deterrence will remain viable.
So, with regards to economic sanctions placed on North Korea has had to resort to some more desperate methods of keeping their economy working, getting the money and food that they need. For instance, with recently smuggling arms to what we believe was Egypt. So, what new methods will North Korea attempt to find to keep their economy afloat? And how is the U.S. and its allies going to have to move forward in making sure that these sanctions really work and that Korea keeps feeling the pressure?
Well, I think that what we've seen over decades now is that the North Koreans have been remarkably creative and persistent in finding new ways to generate foreign exchange and to kind of keep the whole project going, the project being the DPRK, but including its nuclear missile program, and also has organized a society that is used to great deprivation. Now, one thing Kim Jong Un has done is, over the last 5 years since he took power, this is not a direct answer to your question, but he has opened up the economy, not opened it, reformed it, I guess, to the extent that private markets are allowed. And when you have a people with the talent of the people of North Korea and the ambition, even if you don't do anything else, just having markets operate unleashes a lot. So they've actually had economic growth over the last few years. Now, what more do they do? Well, they've been selling arms and statues and cigarettes and drugs and you name it. For a lot of years. I think that one area, since specifically, and it was mentioned earlier, that I would really watch is cyber. It's in the press that they got some millions of dollars out of a Bangladeshi bank just by doing something with software. They're at it. This is what their best minds are doing. So I think there is a bit of a whack-a-mole, to the whole sanctions enterprise, which is not to say that you don't do it, but you do. It's an imprecise instrument. The suffering does fall. If I can cite Mr. Kim again, talking about, as we've seen in other countries, the way sanctions play in the country itself is the regime says, well, the reason you don't have white rice to eat anymore, and the reason that there's a shortage of this and that is because of sanctions imposed by the Americans, or maybe even at times they'll say by the Chinese. So it can serve to reinforce the regime's hold on power, to reinforce the sense of national both pride and defensiveness on the part of the population. And we don't know when it's going to be effective. But we're dealing with a very, very resilient and creative country that's been at this for a long time.
I would just jump on what you just said at the very end. We have to keep in mind or always ask ourselves, what are sanctions for? Are they just to punish? Or they shouldn't be. What they should be for is creating enough discomfort or pain to show another path or another option. And I think we've been really weak in, I think I lay a lot of the blame of the Obama administration as well. That what became this default strategic patience policy, that they didn't label that. I think outside observers did. But we have not been clear, in as much as we haven't been clear about deterrence and what the implications are. We have not been clear, and I think, frankly, it's because we're not serious about offering off-ramps, whether they're economic off-ramps, diplomatic off-ramps, and then to the stasis of the armistice. And so I'm not suggesting we remove the current sanctions, but unless there's a flip side of that coin, they won't be effective. It's going to be like London under the Blitz. It does steal the resolve. The other thing I would say, though, is that there's two ramp-ups would be an utter blockade, which China won't go for, but which is very provocative in itself. And I think the Trump administration has started to do this. It hasn't had the backlash that it had earlier, but you remember the Banco Delta Asia sanctions. what is that, 2004, 5? They got the attention of Pyongyang because they targeted the elite and their personal pocketbooks, and they were pissed. And what we didn't realize that was to unwind them was really a bureaucratic headache. But the other, I guess, possibility, and even that takes time, is targeting the individuals who are benefiting from the regime. But again, if you're going to do that, what do you have on offer?
No, I think that was well covered.
Thank you. This is Roger Dong, former defense attaché, 30 years. And what has become obvious, maybe not so obvious from all your comments, is that Mr. is bluffing us. And we're not taking advantage of that. The fear of nuclear weapons prohibits us from really thinking about this creatively. Some of the positive things that we can do to negotiate, we should do. He does not want to die. He wants to live like his father and grandfather until they die natural death. We can sort of guarantee it sort of ways. But he's bluffing us, and we should not overreact to that. He knows that if the balloon goes up, we can wipe him out in 48 hours. He knows that. He doesn't want that. He wants to live. Take advantage of that. We should negotiate that. Start negotiating with that. We might pull some of our troops back from Korea. A couple of other incentives, but the fact is, I think we haven't taken the right approach to this, to dealing with Mr.
So do we have two paper tigers here, or
This is the that roared.
I would say I agree with that. I think what Robert was saying earlier, when you said, President Trump isn't helping, I think you were referring to the tweets. But the other things that aren't helping are added displays of force. B-1 bombers flying further north along the coast than they have in a long, long time. Like, they already know what we can do, right? Now, some would argue, well, that's to show resolve to the South Koreans and so on. Well, I would say the same thing. They know what we can do. We have these joint exercises every spring. That's the opposite. That's uncreative. It's almost knee-jerk. That's enough already. They know our military capabilities and our joint military capabilities. And so, how about something creative? Now, I would have said years ago, maybe months ago, that's political suicide in the U.S. You can't talk to evil, right? You can't. There's a political price to be paid in Congress or in the White House or in the administration if you're going to talk to evil. Well, this might be one thing President Trump doesn't have to worry about. I mean, as we've used polite words like it's unprecedented or it's untraditional. It's Wild West. So if Trump says it, whether it's his political base or others might just say, well, why not? Some people have sort of sloppily said, well, he's the great deal maker. Maybe he can cut a deal. I'd love to have him cut a deal. I just have not seen anything deal-worthy yet.
First of all, I would not call it a bluff. I would say but I don't think, as I said earlier, that Kim Jong Un is looking to provoke or start a war. However, should there be, and this is where you get these discussions about preemptive, preventive attacks, whether it's to take out nuclear facilities, to take out the regime, targeted, surgical. I know the military hates those words, and so do I, because there really is no such thing on the Korean Peninsula. And I think that we have to expect that in the event of some military attack from the United States, even if we saw it as being targeted, that there would be some kind of retaliation. Now, maybe it would be a proportional retaliation, as seen from Pyongyang, but there would be a retaliation. And his options, as we've already discussed, are rather limitless and involve the massive taking, potentially, of civilian lives. Both Korean and Americans as well as others. So I wouldn't call it a bluff, and that's what makes the military options, always unappetizing, if I may say, but really, really challenging on the Korean Peninsula. I think, if I can say, the way forward here is we start, and I agree, there's less this allergy to we shouldn't talk to people who are not nice people. It kind of went away a while ago, but it did hamper us for a while, 10 years ago. Let's have talks about talks. That's the lowest possible bar you have. You have talks about talks. You go in. You each say things that the other's not going to agree with. And you can call that, unilateral declarations. And they're going to say, you must accept us as a nuclear power. And we're going to say, we just unilaterally say that our goal remains, and again, I'm not wordsmithing it here, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. North Korea signed up to that many times. They say they don't sign up to anymore. We say, no, we still do. That's the way we're proceeding. And they may say something, we unilaterally say that all American troops should leave. Well, we don't agree with that right now, but okay, you said it out there. Then we have a lot but let's talk. So what do we have to talk about? Deterrence. How do we do that? Safety measures. So basically, you do some of the things that we've done with other states that have nuclear weapons, but that doesn't mean that we are recognizing them as nuclear weapon state. And that may sound a little, but I think that the distinction is important. But you get into something like that, and then you're ready to do a little bit of trading, of lowering, and we freeze for freeze. Do you talk about adjustments in military exercises? There's some objection to that, but that's something that may be on the table. Do you begin to talk about what might replace the armistice? We won't get there for a while, but you begin that process. I think that's the direction we need to go.
Your point about other nuclear states, Pakistan, remember Pakistan? Osama bin Laden, I think, lived there for a little while. They have nuclear weapons. Do we recognize them as a nuclear state? Not legally. De facto, yes. We provide them I don't know if this year we do, but we for years have provided them about $100 million a year specifically to improve the safety and security of their nuclear arsenal, specifically what are called PRPs, Personnel Reliability Programs. You think we love doing that? Well, no, but we recognize the validity that it's important. A counterexample is India. Same status, but it's democratic. It's more of an ally. Under the George W. Bush administration, we offered them membership in what's called the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Nothing to do with weapons per se, but a club. And heretofore, it had been if you have nuclear weapons, you're not allowed in there. But the Bush administration saw greater benefits in things like trade and alliance reinforcement and so on. So there's precedent for this, is my point.
So, Admiral Thomas, we did have, the Soviet Union was a pretty odious regime, but we managed to swallow it and verify with them fairly frequently. Is that a possibility here, or is the tension level just too high at this point? The points of communication too low?
No, I think that it is absolutely an option. In fact, as we've kind of teased out this idea of having that conversation without a lot of preconditions, and I'm almost, kind of befuddled that I'm contemplating this, but for many, many administrations, we had so many steps that we had to go through, and the ambassador often had to execute those steps. For the Japanese, it would be called kabuki theater. You have to do a lot to get to the punchline. This administration, oddly enough, to Paul's point, is such a wild card that maybe you can get to a direct North Korea, U.S. conversation. At that point, the thing that most concerns me is wither South Korea. I think you absolutely have to keep them involved, to President Moon's point. And so that dialogue should happen. One of the things that gets trotted out routinely was, and Kathleen mentioned, is freeze for freeze. Well, from a military perspective, my estimate, if we took Ulchi Freedom Guardian tomorrow and said, we'll take a pass for a year, our military readiness would not suffer. However, Michael Schiffer and Joe Yoon and others will tell you, hey, Robert, you got to be careful, because the last time that was trotted out was a couple of years ago, remember? And we said, we're not comfortable with legitimizing their bad behavior, their violation of UN security resolutions, and us giving up legitimate exercises that are actually monitored by the UN. I think most of you realize that there's an organization, another acronym, but it's basically the UN's Armistice Maintenance Commission, and it's military officers from other countries, Norway, Sweden, wherever, that monitor the U.S. ROC exercises to make sure that they're in compliance with armistice maintenance. So their rub was, hey, freeze for freeze, all of a sudden we're taking a legitimate UN-sanctioned effort and we are, condoning violating UN security resolutions by agreeing to that, freeze for freeze option. From strictly a military perspective, you've got that maneuver space if you wanted it.
So as you've previously said, South Korea currently has very limited options regarding this situation. It has historical conflict with Japan, it's souring relationship with China, and currently does not have an established connection or trust with the current U.S. administration.
But other than that, you're looking good. Right.
So we have a pretty strong military, and as you've mentioned, there is a growing population of people who believe that the U.S. presence in the Korean Peninsula is more of a detriment than a benefit. That being said, I would like to know your opinion on the hypothetical situation where Korea decides to take matter into its own hands, get control of its military fully, and either decides to build up its own nuclear program or takes other actions to get control of the situation.
That's the worst case scenario.
You want me to start on that one? All right. Well, I'll tee it up, and then I'll turn it over to the experts. The Republic of Korea military, as I said, is extremely capable. And when you look at militaries and the way you assess them in aggregate, there's really 4 dimensions that you need to look at. You need to look at command, and command is a country's political will to use its military and what the rules of engagement it allows. Control, which is the actual way it communicates and how it handles various elements of its military. And the Republic of Korea has a joint force. It has a Joint Chiefs of Staff, just like the U.S. It is fully integrated with the ROC Army, the ROC Navy, the ROC Marine Corps, and the ROC Air Force, and an additional element of special forces that's extremely capable. Where it runs into a little bit of a rub is capacity. Fortunately, it's tuned for operations on the Korean Peninsula and the surrounding maritime environment. From a readiness perspective, the ROC military is absolutely ready to take control of its own destiny in defense against a North Korean attack or for operations outside of the Korean theater of operations, global peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, disaster response, a lot of military operations other than war. And I'll kind of leave it at that and turn it over to the rest of the team.
I guess I'm going to go up to about 30,000 feet or higher and just make a couple of very general comments. I guess one is, yes, certainly South Korea will continue to strengthen its own capabilities, its military capabilities, its relationship with other countries, and so on. But, we focused here on North Korea. But, the other big geopolitical thing happening, or the much bigger thing really, is China's future role the re-rise of China and what that means for the region. And I think what we're seeing now is, the jury, shall we say, is still out. We still don't know what kind of role China is going to play in the region and in the world. And I think this concerns and should concern all of us, including Koreans. I'm not saying it's going to be a bad thing. I'm just saying we don't know yet. And much as at the end of the Qing dynasty, when Korea was so weak and China was so weak, Korea looked to the United States, a unified Korea, to have a neighbor or have a friend who didn't share a border. To have some additional added capacity. I can't see, a South Korea thinking right now is a good opportunity to say we'll just pass up on that and we'll do some other things ourselves. I think, moreover, we have this history of you can say that we have this history we've built together. And certainly in the years I've seen in Korea, I've been in Korea, it's a different question from whether or not there are U.S. troops there or not. To me, that is, with all due respect, less important than the fact that we have ties we didn't have 40 or 50 years ago. The diaspora here, the shared values, I think those really mean something. The extraordinary economic ties. Maybe, to jump to my conclusion, maybe you end up with a Korea, a unified Korea, that looks a little bit like Finland. Those of us who are old enough to remember, Finlandization meant, right? Finland didn't join NATO. It didn't have a military alliance with the United States. There weren't any U.S. troops there or anything. But it was integrated with the West. And it joined the EU. So it had this special relationship with Russia, if you like, but it also hedged against that giant on its border with this very, very special relationship with the United States and the West. Maybe there's a different future for the Korean Peninsula. I don't want to sit here and say that I know what it should be or will be 10 or 20 years from now. But I think right now, for South Korea, really it has no choice, and I don't mean this in a terribly depressing way, but to try to strengthen the relationship with a challenging American administration, and also to do as Moon Jae-in says he wants to do, despite some pressure domestically, to have a forward-looking relationship with Japan, with which it does share a lot of strategic interests, notwithstanding its difficult history and past.
I'm the least expert here on this question, but I'm going to take a shot because in listening to you ask the question, a couple of things struck me. It was in very sort of geopolitical questions, military, government, and so on. And I can't help but think when we were asked to come tonight and had a discussion about it, unlike, say, the Korea Society in New York or the Asia Society in New York, we're 30 miles from Silicon Valley, right? So I thought that what popped into my mind was Samsung and Kia and Hyundai. And if you were concerned about, say, Google and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, if North Korea was 30 miles off our west coast, we might be having a very different conversation. So, I mean, you use the phrase economic ties, but let's go down another level. And again, it's completely unsophisticated, but I would imagine, or I wonder, this is something maybe we should talk about during the reception, but what about those incredibly significant corporations, and do they have conversations with the Blue House? I have to imagine they do. Increasingly, this might be the sort of world of sci-fi, but we see corporations as incredibly significant and influential entities. Some might even have a concern like, well, they're more like a state than a company. So I'm not going to be able to sort of nail the landing here, but I think that's a factor or a facet of this that would go to that question. Would that be something that corporate South Korea would have an interest in, or would they be less interested in that?
So we've come to the end of our time here. But I just can't help myself. I got to ask one last quick question. So I'm going to ask you in 10 words or less. 10 words or less. 140 characters. What happens, in a tweet. What happens, how do we get out of this situation intact without the miscalculation leading to war? So what does success look like in maybe the next, for the duration of the Trump administration?
So I'm going to exceed the 10 words. I don't think we quote get out of the situation. I think the situation kind of it continues to progress. Again, maybe I'm using hope as a course of action, but I think there's a scenario where sanctions actually do start to bite in ways that are meaningful, and that the U.S. and North Korea, with additional nations involved, especially South Korea, start this dialogue. At that point, then Kim Jong-un's objectives are assured. Regime survival is number one, regime survival is number two, regime survival is number three, okay? But his nuclear ballistic missile capabilities have served as the deterrent. He knows he can't actually use it kinetically, or that eliminates priorities 1, 2, and 3. So I think this looks a lot like status quo with some options for dialogue over the next couple of years.
Kathleen?
Okay. 10 words. Yeah.
Make it
Yeah. Defend, contain, deter, cooperate with South Korea and Japan, find that off-ramp, that's a little more, to talks quickly, and avoid escalation and misunderstanding.
Paul, you get the last word.
Stop being in denial. And using China's 3 no's, I would say rekindle the conversation with Beijing.
So it's been interesting. On behalf of the Asia Society and our board and our supporters and our members, I'd like to welcome you all to a little reception afterwards, I think. But it's been a great conversation, and I appreciate everyone coming and look forward to continuing off the record. Thank you.
Yeah, I might see what you guys are.